And good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Farnham, CTO with Set Solutions. I want to say thank you very much for joining us today. We are joined today by Rapid7. So before we introduce them, I want to kind of go through some housekeeping exercises. First of all, this is Tech Thursday. So what we have as Tech Thursday here at Set Solutions is it's a way for us internally at Set Solutions to stay up to date with our different partners, vendor partners, so we can provide you value as our customers. And we've been doing this for several years now, and we decided this year, with everything going on, hey, let's turn that inside out and give a view to our customers on how we stay up to date with our partners. So this is one of those, what we call external facing or customer facing Tech Thursdays. And it is, again, a view into how we stay up to date and how we provide you value. So hopefully you enjoy this. I know several people that are on here have done this with us a couple of times before. So thank you for rejoining us, and anybody new, thank you for coming on for the first time. So real quick housekeeping, you should have, when you registered for this, received gift cards for lunch via email. If you did not receive those or haven't found those, please check your spam folder first. We see that going into spam every once in a while. If you don't see that in your junk or spam folder, please let Lauren Lynch know. You should have received emails from her as well when you registered. She can get that for you. Also, speaking of gift cards, at the end of this, we will be sending out an email that will have a video link to this and have some other links, and it will also have a link to a Google survey. So please enter into that, or go into that survey, answer all the questions. First of all, it gives us an opportunity to answer any questions you have, make sure we're doing the right thing if there's any changes you'd like to see. And second of all, it gets you in the drawing for a $100 Amazon gift card. So you have a chance to win that. So please fill that out if you would. And then during this, we have got two ways for you to reach out to us with any questions you have. We've got the typical Zoom chat window down at the bottom, and you can click on that. And there's also, which is a little more preferred if you don't mind, using the Q&A box. And that way it allows us to keep track of what questions have been asked and what we have answered. So if you would do that, I would greatly appreciate it. And we will definitely be answering stuff at the end, but there will probably be some engagement with Justin through the whole talk as well. So that's all over, all housekeeping done. Now I'd like to introduce Justin Prince, who's a VRM practice technical advisor at Rapid7. Justin, thank you for joining us, and I'll let you take over from here.
Perfect. Thank you for the intro, Michael, and thank you for having us on for the Tech Thursday with Set Solutions. It's definitely nice to get in front of some folks and anyone who's dialed in. And we usually get some stragglers after the top of the hour. Thanks for giving us your time. We'll try and keep it lively. And as Michael mentioned, I am a technical advisor for our vulnerability risk management practice at Rapid7. What I focus on, basically live and breathe, for better or worse, is vulnerability management around the clock, and the struggles that our customers, that our friends in the field have, and how we can make things better. So I want to walk through exactly how we can do that, and we'll focus on our primary vulnerability management solution, InsightVM, as we do that. I am not much of a slideware guy, so I do have some slides for some of the pieces that are a little more conceptual or a little tougher to show in a live demo, but I do want to spend the bulk of our time in the solution itself. And as Michael said, if the questions come in, we'll answer what we can live, and we'll save some time at the end. Knock on wood, I'll keep an eye on the clock and do it there as well. In terms of the agenda, I kept the overall title of the presentation fairly straightforward and simple. We want to talk about vulnerability management. I wouldn't blame you if you called these a little buzzy, and that's okay. You know, when we talk about understanding risk across modern environments, we're talking about finding that risk, and finding risk starts with finding the stuff, finding your assets, understanding what's out there. So establishing visibility and then assessing for issues and potential issues on those devices. We're talking about scans, network scans, agents, discovery connections, ways to get data into the vulnerability management solution. Measuring and communicating progress is where, historically we've seen the wheels fall off a little bit when we talk about vulnerability management programs in general. We've got a lot of folks out there who are scanning and maybe struggling with the amount of data that we get back. And you'll hear folks say, especially when we start to talk about SIMs and other IT and security solutions, our problem isn't necessarily collecting the data. There are problems with that. Our problem is figuring out what to do with it. We oftentimes will collect so much. And we're not just ingesting it and using it as one team. We need to share it with additional teams. And the easiest way to get someone to do something is to make it easy, is to give them something actionable, give them something that makes sense, gets them bought into the process. So I'll talk about that throughout the presentation and demo. There's an emotional component that goes just beyond the technical X's and O's when it comes to vulnerability management. And driving remediation should be, I'm hesitant to call it the last part of the process, because this should be something that always happens. You should always be doing all of these things: finding, prioritizing, remediating. But remediation is where the rubber meets the road, and we have to either do it ourselves or get our colleagues in other departments and business units. It used to be the classic InfoSec versus IT scenario, or InfoSec versus the world is more apt. And now we're talking about DevSecOps. We're talking about teams who maybe historically have not had to manage risk or had not had to consume output from a vulnerability management solution. So making it easy, making it digestible for those teams, but actually getting something done. If you're going to identify the risk, you want to reduce it as well. And as mentioned, we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers. Little graphic over on the side is the way we envision that overall process, or how folks should think about their vulnerability management programs in terms of those components. Establishing visibility, running your assessment in a variety of ways, prioritizing, ideally automatically, the incoming data, and then remediating. And where some folks experience that or run that as a scan, rinse, repeat program, we want to put solutions in place, put processes and enable the actual people to do this in a nonstop fashion. Not once a month, not once a quarter, but always be assessing risk and removing it from your environment. So that's that's the agenda and a little bit of a soapbox. But as an intro to the whole Rapid7 approach or story, we are talking about vulnerability management here today with InsightVM, and you can see it in the bottom left of this graphic here. But our vulnerability management solution and our organization as a whole, with our security focus, with our focus on the attacker side of the house, is really strengthened by the other solutions and the services that we offer. So whether it's application security, cloud security posture management, detection and response, security orchestration and automation, SOAR technologies that we can use to tie all these solutions together in ways that we just didn't think were possible or didn't have the capabilities to do previously. But down the bottom there, it's so important to us to fold research and to fold learnings from our services. So anything that we offer as a solution, especially when we're talking about vulnerability management or detection and response, we can also offer as a service to augment the existing people and processes and technologies. And then we want to fold that back into our solution to make it better. And I'll show you a few examples of that in the solution from a value standpoint. You don't have to have all these things, but we as a single vendor with this portfolio that covers so much of the security realm, we're able to offer solutions that are made better by each other, regardless of what you've deployed. In some cases, even if you're not a customer, that's okay too. And we'll talk about things like our open research projects and our attacker KB website that you can leverage.
Hey, Justin, I'm going to go out on a limb if you go back to that other one and say that cloud will eventually be named Insight Cloud.
Fair enough. Yeah. We've struggled with that as an industry, as a vendor. But it's a good call out to make me step back there. And all of these solutions we're building on the backbone of our cloud infrastructure, which is the Insight Cloud. It was the Insight platform for quite some time, but what that lets us do then, and I was trying to take off the sales hat for a little bit, is if you do have multiple solutions in-house, they don't feel disjointed. They're all tied together. They're able to leverage each other. It's a seamless set of use cases for our customers. So I appreciate that. And definitely something that unifies the whole story is really tying these solutions together on the back end. A couple of quick slides just to have a little fun. You know, when we talk about why we're here in general, you know, why are we in security roles? Why are we talking about vulnerability management? You know, this is not a new set of technologies and not a new problem. Why haven't we perfected it yet? The spoiler is we haven't, and probably won't for quite some time as a general industry. But there's just too much work. It was mentioned for any folks who were able to listen to the podcast last week. You know, we've got scenarios where the incoming threats, the amount of vulnerabilities has just grown to such a degree. Things are so much more commoditized. More folks are getting involved. It's creating a lot of work that has generally fallen to the information security teams. And we're operating in these silos where, as I mentioned, if you've got InfoSec and any folks who have joined that sit primarily in InfoSec, and I know a lot of people wear multiple hats, have at some point or another sent out that graphic that says information security is everyone's responsibility. And that's about as much outreach as we can possibly get. We're now forced to deal with multiple teams, and from a good holistic approach, we should be dealing with these teams and getting them involved, because lowering risk at the organization level, it truly is everyone's responsibility. So we want to break down those walls and get those teams to play nicer together. That does not mean that we can immediately eliminate those DMZs between, you know, InfoSec and devs and IT ops and all those other folks, but we can certainly remove some of that friction. Limited resources is a good and a bad thing. I'm pretty sure everyone on the line right now, you're a hot resource. There's not enough of us. We don't have enough talent. We don't have enough folks willing to get in there and do this work. We're in high demand. That's a great thing. There's too much work. That's not such a great thing. So when we talk about efficiencies and automation wherever possible, we're not talking about removing the human component. This is not automated checkout at the grocery store. We're talking about giving you time back. We're talking about moving through those day-to-day things, those routines in such a way that you can do your job as an InfoSec professional. Now, why is that? Why are we really here? A lot of us are here because of the humble spreadsheet. And in some ways, I hate to knock the spreadsheet and the CSV and the XML output, but that's all we've known. That's all we've had available to use and then turn around and deliver to these other teams. And it's left some really bad feelings in InfoSec, in vulnerability management. Now, vulnerability management, as I mentioned, is something I work on 24/7. I'm actually incredibly passionate about vulnerability management, not what it is, but what it can be. And the reason is because a lot of teams are spending far too much time on vulnerability management. It's a cornerstone of information security. You'd be hard pressed to argue that anyone can afford not to do some level of vulnerability assessment, vulnerability management. But realistically, it should take up a much smaller amount of your time so that you can do what you're actually there to do, which is to be the subject matter expert, to be the security professional that can help your organization lower their risk, that can spot things that might have gone otherwise unnoticed because you were perfecting your pivots and your graphs out of your spreadsheets. So there's always an application for those. There's a reason to use them, and we'll get back to that when we talk about reporting, but we don't want to have to be constrained just to raw volumes of data. There's got to be a better way for us to do this. So we start to ease into the actual technology, whereas again, I'll spend most of my time here, but it helps to set the stage a little bit from, you know, an architecture perspective. What are we talking about? You know, you see on the other side of the firewall there, the Rapid7 Insight Cloud, as Michael so aptly called out earlier. There you go. We named it a couple slides later. We've got what we call a security console that lives inside your firewall. That's the brains of the operation, whereas it synchronizes to the cloud and provides that analytics overlay. It allows us to crunch numbers in a way that you wouldn't have to have that supercomputer in-house. And we're over time shifting more functionality to be cloud-centric because we're very interested and devoted to shrinking footprints in our customers' environments. And the footprint also includes, as you notice here, scan engines, insight agents, necessities that need to live in the environment or need to interact with targets of some kind. It used to be servers and workstations were all we worried about, but now we just say scan targets or assets. The idea of the asset has changed so much as we crept into 2020. But we've got those components that will collect data from your environment or actively assess it and let us present that back to you in various formats. And along the bottom, just to call out some of the in-product integrations, either direct integrations, could be API handshakes, it could be, you notice on the bottom left there, the orchestrator, part of our SOAR set of capabilities built into the InsightVM license, automation assisted patching, automated containment, things that we would use a local device to kind of reach out to those other systems, because you probably wouldn't open them up to the cloud. And sometimes we do have those conversations, in order to assess that target, you need unfettered access. So there is that component of security layered on top of your security, where we want to give you very open and creative deployment options so that you can get as much information from your environment without reducing any of your security to do so. So the pieces I'll talk about with just a few more slides are really how we establish that initial visibility. And this is because we won't run scans and sit there and watch paint dry as part of the tech talk. But we will set the stage for how we get this data into the solution in the first place. So establishing initial visibility can be a huge challenge. And you'll talk to some folks who say, look, I scan my Windows assets because I'm not quite sure what to do with my Linux assets, or I don't know what's out there. Or as we get into virtual environments, it used to always be VMware was the tricky one. IT held the keys, InfoSec didn't know what was going on. Now it's AWS and Azure and beyond. We want a variety of ways to understand what's out there, because the very first step is understanding the attack surface, both internal and external. What devices are deployed, what's out there offering potential foothold to sometimes a malicious actor, sometimes our lovely coworkers who just don't realize they're doing something wrong, especially with so many local admins out there. We need to provide that safety net for our organizations. So we have network scans, we've got point and shoot. Hey, let's drop in a subnet, let's drop in a CIDR block, and let's go out and we'll run discovery and assessment on that IP range. And we'll fingerprint what's alive. And then if we find it's alive, we'll throw some vulnerability checks at it. We've got a few options there though. We've got fully unauthenticated discovery. Just tell me what's alive out there and do some basic fingerprinting, maybe some TCP/IP stack analysis, things like that. We also include authenticated discovery. So give me some creds, let me log in and not just fingerprint the device. Hey, it's alive and it's a Win10 box. What's installed on it? Give me some other criteria that I can use to go back and classify that device before I get into that third bullet, which is a vulnerability or a policy-based scan, your CIS scans and disastigs and custom policy scans, things like that. I always call that out because from a licensing perspective, we don't really care how much you discover. Best practices, I'm going to tell you discover everything possible in your environment. And then, maybe the best practice is also to scan all of that, but that's a decision you need to make after you understand what's out there. So discovery scans, we just gather that data. You decide if you want to do a vuln assessment or a policy assessment after the fact. Those are snapshots in time. Multiple folks here probably have hit that button and watched even like an Nmap scan run and get some results back. Environments are very dynamic. So sometimes even a scan that takes a couple minutes, the outlook has changed dramatically from beginning to end. Those devices no longer exist. New devices have popped up. It used to be we just worried about laptops coming and going, and now we worry about ephemeral assets. We worry about things spinning up, getting terminated, torn down as needed. So we wanted a way to kind of skip that if possible, right? And we built out our dynamic discovery connections for that purpose to query another system of record. I list a few here, but DHCP was always my favorite. Hey, if it's on the network, someone gave it an IP address, so maybe it's coming from that DHCP server. Why not just read that log at very quick intervals and say, based on this information, we know what's out there. We know who's in the network, who's not. We can even automate scans based on that point of entry if we want to. But it saves us a lot of time, because rather than having to do, say, discovery across a class A or a B, even a bunch of C's, now we just ask that other system and it tells us who's out there, which is really nice. And I'll show some of these as we go through the technology. The last one here is the API. We've got a robust REST API at the console level. You can use that to create your own target. So it could be we're pulling it out of some other solution, a CMDB or otherwise, or we're creating them from scratch. You can do it fully automated and scripted. You can poke away at Postman if you like, but again, why not skip that discovery phase and establish your targets and then go ahead and jump right into the vulnerability or policy assessment if possible. And just a couple more, and then we'll skip over. From an agent perspective, agents are a funny thing, because between 5 to 10 years ago, agents were on the outs. Folks had run into that scenario where they had 24 agents on their endpoints. They're all fighting over each other, and anything bad that possibly happened to anyone, you blamed it on the agent, right? You spill your coffee on your keyboard, it was that new agent that popped up in my sys tray. And agents became cool again at some point, because folks realized, the laptop model was an obvious one, the remote workforce. 2020 has shown us that if we were prepared and we had visibility in those devices when they left our corporate network, we were all the better for it. But we also have scenarios where folks can't reach certain devices with a targeted scan from an engine, or didn't want to spray admin credentials across their network for whatever reason. So a variety of use cases. What's really nice is we designed the agent to complement the scans. So you can actually run one or the other. We say run both, why not? Because you've got a scenario where agents get installed administratively. They don't really need any instruction beyond that. Every 6 hours, they're going to report back results. So multiple times per day, you're getting an assessment of what's going on with that device. And they're running all your local checks. It's not a localized scan engine. And that goes back to the concept of really wanting to shrink our footprint and have an agent that was polite. If we were running those localized scans, your end users would notice, you'd notice, and we're back to square one. Agents would not be cool again. So we want something unobtrusive that just kind of sits there and does its job, truly set it and forget it. Now, from a scan perspective, that's an active scan. That's an A to B network scan. It's coming from a scan engine in your network, and it's hitting one or more targets, more than likely more, sometimes up into the several thousands. And whether it's an authenticated or unauthenticated scan, we wanted some options to tie that together with the agent. So again, from a deployment scenario, from a visibility scenario, you're not worried about how you get that data. We're going to skip ahead to what you do with that data. From a agent plus engine approach, unauthenticated scans, we can just go ahead and we use the concept of universal unique identifiers. It's the best way to correlate, aside from heuristics based on host name, MAC address, and IP, and they are useful in that order. A lot of folks will think a MAC address is more useful. Host name is probably the best. IP address is probably the worst, especially in dynamic environments. One reason to use UUIDs is, for correlation purposes, you got to keep your licensing clean. If someone has 2,000 assets, you can't say you have 4,000. You can't have duplicates. The other part of it is you have messy reports, and that goes back to those, breaking down the silos between teams. If I'm InfoSec, everyone on the call is IT, and I hit you with a bunch of reports that are just not correct. These aren't devices that exist. There's a lot of duplicates. You're chasing a lot of ghost assets. You lose faith in that process. So very important to correlate, and we can use these system-derived values for Windows. It's a BIOS derived value. We've got it for networking equipment, for Linux devices, for virtual devices in the cloud. Is we'll use that UUID to say, hey, this is the same device it's always been. So if it's IP hopping around in a dynamic environment, it doesn't matter. You don't have to chase it. We chase it for you, and we report it back to you. Agents, it sounds kind of weird to talk about UUIDs and say that there are multiples, but depending on what we're using, it's a scan UUID or an agent UUID, we can correlate those together. So for something like an unauthenticated scan, hey, there's an agent on here, let's correlate that. So we are able to report the UUID and combine those results together. Something like an agent gives you all those local checks. With an unauthenticated scan, you're getting remote checks. You're not authenticating as part of the scan process. You're doing that outside in, hey, what ports and services are running? tell me what's up. And then we'll smash those two things together for you. On the flip side, with authenticated scans, this is where we can start to introduce some efficiency, because we can say from an authenticated perspective, actually, you know what? An agent is on that device. I don't need to rerun all those checks. The agent's already gathered them for me. So think of a scenario where you've got discovery connections, cutting out that discovery piece. You've got agents self-reporting, collecting data from your endpoints, and you still want to hit it with a remote scan, authenticated or unauthenticated. We can go ahead and skip those checks that have already been performed, as long as we can reliably correlate. And again, you're reducing scan time, but more important under the covers, especially for us in InfoSec, you're reducing resource utilization. So we know when we get into proofs of concept, when we deploy with our customers, InfoSec sometimes asks for the world. They craft this big list of resources they want, knowing they probably only get a fraction of it. So I hope everybody kind of overscopes a little. But we know that those resources are precious, virtual or otherwise. So let's go ahead and use them as efficiently as we possibly can. So again, those are things that are a little tricky to show in the interface itself from a conceptual standpoint, but we'll cover some of that and more as we slide into what do we actually do with this data? How do we prioritize? How do we start to remediate and share it out with teams? I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A. If anyone had questions, you can certainly drop them in. If not, let's go ahead and get right into the technology. Fingers crossed I didn't time out during that. I think I'm okay. I refreshed right beforehand. But this is InsightVM. This is our flagship vulnerability management solution. And I'm starting, I would say, in the middle of the process by showing you my personalized dashboard here. And dashboards were something, we've had them for quite some time now, but folks had always asked, and will always ask, it's almost a checkbox for any solution, is where are your dashboards, where are your pie charts? Give me a way to, maybe export those and share them as part of a routine meeting. And we think of dashboards as part of the prioritization process. They don't sit necessarily with the final reports, although they certainly can be used as such. And what I mean by that is dashboards can be a springboard into any other part of the solution, especially for the purpose of our discussion here. I can take any one of these dashboards and maybe drill into a card and see, what's going on in my environment at any level. In this case, exploitable assets by skill level. How easy is it to take advantage of these susceptible devices or susceptible vulnerabilities? I may want to go ahead and load some existing queries or write my own popular easy ones, or say operating system is Windows. Almost the first thing we see a lot of folks do is do the Windows versus Linux breakdown, and then realize they have vastly more of each than they thought they did in their environment. But this is a really nice way to take what started as a high level view of your environment and start to squeeze it down into particular things you want to focus on. And while the OS is certainly interesting, what if we were to say, let's go ahead and look at all of my devices that live in a particular asset group or were tagged a certain way. So as you start to work with devices in the target environment, they might carry some asset tags we've assigned, and we'll go through that, or they might be in certain groups. Let's go ahead and just look at those, and let's look at the exploitability level within, in this case, our workstations that are associated with our billing department. So geolocations are another popular way that folks will break things down. Perfectly valid. Business units, asset types, there's really no rules in terms of what you do. What we want is a way for you to triangulate down on things that might be most important. And this particular dashboard is one I just cobbled together out of cards I found to be interesting. You can use any of the pre-built cards available here, and you can funnel them or filter them down as needed. In this case, I've thrown some KPI, some trending, things like that, all of my assets with agents. I have an SLA that we'll take a peek at in just a moment. But we also built a bunch of dashboards. I'm a global admin, so I'm in God mode. I can kind of see what everybody else is building in our demo lab. I can go in and I can look at things like, hey, let's just look at my threat feed dashboard. And the threat feed dashboard is really interesting because this goes back to an idea that I mentioned earlier in the slides of sharing from other solutions, sharing from open source Intel, of course, but also our services, our research projects. And what I mean by that is our most common actively targeted vulnerabilities card, as an example, it gives you a list of vulnerabilities in your environment. Again, we've pulled these by network scan, by agent-based collection and assessment, whatever it may be. And we say, we know these are being used in the wild for some reason. It could be a vendor advisory. It could be something open and obvious. We're several years removed and the WannaCries are still popping up, right? No shocker there that this is open source info. I would argue something like Bluekeep, open source info as well, but we're also seeing hits of that or folks probing for that in our honeypot network. So Project Heisenberg is a research project where we've got a global network of honeypots, low interaction, doing what honeypots do best, just kind of sitting there and seeing how people attack them. And we share that with our customers and say, it looks like people are probing these and you've got them in your environment. So maybe all other things considered, maybe you want to skip these to the top of the list in terms of your remediation. We've also got scenarios where we offer a managed detection response service, so 24/7 SOC down in Arlington, Virginia. And if our team sees customers of that service, same thing, getting probed, getting attacked in certain ways, the attack being the worst case scenario. Usually it's the low level kind of automated probes before we get a human collector involved or a human operator. But same rules apply. We're seeing this in the wild and you've got them in your environment. So maybe you want to jump those to the top of the list and go ahead and remediate those. We were also able to, I'll jump back from a prioritization perspective in just a second, but I know this is top of mind for everyone. We're probably all, most of us are sitting in our home offices. If we're lucky enough to have the home office and we're not in the kitchen or something, we've got the external and remote workforce assets where, yeah, we had to take some liberties here. We had to say, look, this is a non-RFC 1918 address. This looks like it's remote, or it looks like what would be a standard workstation operating system versus server-based technology. But we're able to present that back to folks and say, hey, here's how you can keep track of your external assets and external facing assets from an SSL TLS vulnerabilities perspective. And if the out-of-the-box stuff doesn't work for you, if you were to click on external assets, this query, and say, that doesn't quite align to my environment, that's perfectly fine. You would be able to go in and say, hey, maybe I want, in this case, I'm in the wrong field. I want to tag this as an agent. And maybe if you already had deployed agents as part of the deployment process, you can self-tag them that you don't really have to tag it as an agent because we can tell an agent's on there, but this is a remote worker device. This is a laptop, whatever it may be. You could change those up as needed to suit whatever purpose you have. So we'll come back to dashboards, but again, as I mentioned, there's really no rules for how you use them. And depending on what you do with them, you can go ahead and work directly out of the solution. You can export to PDF as needed. One of the things, and we'll loop back in just a second, is driving remediation off those dashboards. But I feel that to understand the remediation and the prioritization, you do have to take that step back and look at that raw data, even if it's just really quickly. So if we were to say, look at our assets, and our assets page is going to include everything we've assessed, everything we've discovered. It gives you a breakdown of what's what, in scenarios where you've discovered some assets, but you haven't scanned them yet. That's perfectly fine. And you've got your full listing of assets. You've also got your full listing of vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities page, I almost always want to show to everyone. And so I never look at it again, because this is, while it's important and you might want to go in here and cherry pick every now and then, you don't want to live out of the vulnerabilities listing. That's a huge list of problems. That's overwhelming. It frustrates people. It doesn't really give them a step forward. It just says, hey, this is bad. Next month, it's going to get worse. And the month after, it's going to get even worse. And the bad news is, even if you patch a bunch of this stuff, what you win is maybe a couple seconds of relaxation, and then the next wave comes in. So folks are always managing that huge backlog. And my colleague Jessica is always fond of when she helps folks build a better approach, is manage your backlog, absolutely, but stop the bleeding. Look at the emerging threats, look at stuff like the threat feed dashboard, the really important stuff for your environment, part of understanding what's important for environment is getting your InfoSec professionals' noses out of the spreadsheets and using a solution that can really make them more efficient.
Yeah, I remember Justin hearing a pretty well-known security professional one time say that if you would just patch all the vulnerabilities, everything would be fine. And he was completely 100% serious when he said that, and he got a lot of pushback. And he was somebody that was fairly well known in the vulnerability management space.
Yep.
We're kind of like, wait a minute, that's not how you approach this problem.
It's true. It's not wrong. It's completely impossible. I find a couple things. One is most organizations have this weird magical plateau that they can't get below, which is X amount of vulnerabilities or X amount of risk. And for whatever reason, they can't get below it. And then it becomes a scenario of trying to explain to your board, to your executives, these are not the same things. It's not the same level of risk. We're just swimming against the tide. You know, something that also came up on the podcast was years ago, we had a finite number of vulnerabilities, and that was all the known vulnerabilities. And you could maybe, even then it was really hard to wrap your head around them, but we've surpassed that month over month for years now. You know, there's 500,000, I think, known, if my numbers are correct, but they just keep coming. So that's the one part, is you don't get to zero. It's not really zero sum. That's kind of impossible, unless one, you patch all the vulnerabilities, impossible, or you pull the plugs. And I like to tell folks that so they don't get too frustrated is, you know, we can reduce risk to zero pretty easily. Just stop being a business. We've had scenarios, you know, organizations I've worked for and with in the past where, you know, they launched patches that broke legacy software and took critical business systems offline. Hey, guess what? The risk was reduced, but you were losing dollars, losing reputation, all the stuff that they kind of scare you with in terms of InfoSec and data breaches. But that's the truth of it. It's not vulnerability elimination, it's vulnerability management. It's managing risk down to a palatable amount. Now, what palatable is, that's open for interpretation, and that's something that, you know, if we can convey this information to the various stakeholders, we can come to a better consensus versus, hey, everyone, we've got 72 billion risk, and you know, one side of the house is saying, let's get it to zero by next month, and the other side saying, well, let's just chop it in half and call it a win. You lose so much context when you operate just in that model. So it is interesting. There is that emotional component as well. It's a game you can't win unless you consider winning just managing it appropriately. So from a vulnerabilities perspective, and I'll move on from this page, is one of the things we do is create our real risk score. You know, and real risk score is not the end all be all. Scoring will never, ever be perfect. You'll hear us all say that. But it's a really good piece to use to drive remediation. You can't not have any kind of scores or criticalities associated with these vulnerabilities, or otherwise you just have a big bucket of things to do. You don't know where to start and where to finish. So real risk score, a score of 0 to 1,000, takes into context exposure or weaponization of that vulnerability. A lot of vulnerabilities are just conceptual until someone actually figures out how to use it. So in this case, you know, are there malware kits? Are there automated exploitations available? Is there exploit code? And this is where we can leverage Metasploit. You know, when we were able to go out and physically do Black Hat, I like to joke that the biggest line at the Rapid7 booth, and anyone who's been out there has seen it, first was probably for party passes, but the second one was to talk about Metasploit. One, because we offer the pro solution. Two, because we're stewards of the open source project. It's very rabid fan base committing, building exploit code. And the interesting thing is we also look at the exploit database where it's the source code, it's the raw code. You got to figure out what to do with it. Sometimes Metasploit, you need to have the solution, maybe hit a couple buttons. It's not always that easy, but we also like to know the exploit skill level. This carries the huge caveat of we're not that far removed from, I think it was Black Hat a couple of years ago, a bunch of 8-year-olds exploiting, you know, voting machines. I think they did it as a proof of concept. So that has really changed. It's not so much people with the serious technical chops and the pen testers. It's folks with an internet connection and the will and the desire to learn how to use this code. So it makes it all the more important when things are easy to pop. Because there's also, when we talk about commoditized exploitation, you know, you almost think back to when people said Macs don't get viruses. And we know that's not true, but you got to look at user base, you got to look at ease of deployment from the attacker perspective as well. So if we're looking at software and services that have a huge install base in the enterprise network, those are juicy targets. I don't want to work really hard on code that I can't use anywhere. I want something that goes broad. And I'm using broad strokes, but that helps us kind of categorize or add flavor to what these vulnerabilities might be opening up your organization to. In essence, they're academic until someone figures out how to pop them open. There's also a temporal piece. When was it published? When did we update the information? We add new content on a daily basis. Sometimes multiple times per day, you'll see, hey, new content has been added or updated, and we'll change it as needed. That's another thing we've noticed over time is we're far removed from the push button, receive patch, win, move on to the next one. A lot of these are deploy patch, reconfigure, change registry settings, whatever it may be. And there have been vendor rollbacks for very big name software. I don't want to call out on a recording, but scenarios where the vendor said, thumbs up, we fixed it. And then a month later, they said, oops, we did not. Those are punches you have to roll with in terms of vulnerability management. So the score is one part of it, the real risk score. I don't think anyone's going to argue default SSH admin is probably the worst of the worst, but it gives you a little context on the vulnerability. It gives you a number to decrease. It gives you a target to shoot at to reduce amongst everything else. It's very useful for the backlog reduction. If you look at assets, the assets themselves have that aggregate risk score. So every asset has a bunch of vulnerabilities. I'll pick on Win7 here. I don't want to see this in my environment anyways, but this is my vuln lab, so that's okay. And if I look at this asset, I've got an original risk score. It's got a ton of vulnerabilities. I'm going to add those all up, and I'm going to give you, hey, this asset is risky based on out of the box categorization. What I want you to do as a customer of ours is to go in and identify, to tag things as what's important to you, because we want to meet you in the middle on that one. We can't necessarily tell you what's important. In some ways we can. We also, I didn't mention earlier, we've got Project Sonar, a scan the internet initiative that we partner with a few organizations on. If you go to Rapid7 and look at our research information, our open data, I think we're up to 35 terabytes of information we share. If you want to download that and do something with it, you're more than welcome to. But we publish reports and exposure indexes on it. But Project Sonar is something where you can go in and drop in your domain name or your external IPs, and we'll tell you what's hanging out there, what's happening. So in some ways, we'll help you identify those things, and the external facing stuff is probably a little more high priority for you in general. But we'll also give you tools to automatically identify what things should be above the break. The classic example of my internet facing web server versus a dev server in a staging environment somewhere. No one can get to one, everybody can get to the other. If I was to turn over a remediation report to anyone, it's human nature. You're going to look at it and say, well, geez, I don't have to open a change control ticket. I don't need that awful Saturday night, 12 a.m. to 2 a.m. downtime where I got to patch and reconfigure a web server and reboot it and pray it comes back. What we can do is assign a higher level of risk to that web server, so you can't really lose it in the rest of the noise. You can't go out and patch that dev box and say, I've reduced 50% of my risk. I would almost argue you've reduced 0% because that bad thing is still hanging out there. So a little bit of a debate that's always worth having, but we want you to be able to do this either manually or automatically with groups and tags and things like that.
Justin, one of the things I've always, when y'all started moving to this, where it's a lot more, I don't know, granular from a number standpoint. There's always been the qualitative versus quantitative, risk scoring ever since I got into cybersecurity way back in late 90s. Mm-hmm. And while this isn't exactly a qualitative score from a money standpoint, how much am I going to assign to this? I think it gets you in a granular way much closer to being able to kind of focus in on it that way versus just, or quantitative, I should say, I said qualitative, versus just qualitative. So if you're actually assigning something of a quantity to this to make it more visible. I mean, you can roll it up. Customers or like executives can see that. I mean, is that kind of the reasoning behind it?
It is to a degree, and what we found, and it's always a work in progress, is and not to generalize, but the downstream reporting or the or using it to drive remediation is where we've had more success. Again, here's a number, make it smaller. That sounds simple, but it really works when you're chewing through that backlog and when you're handing information over to folks. A lot of people in InfoSec and IT have heard the concept of low-hanging fruit and beyond, right? That's not something that we only talk about, but you hear it a lot in vuln management where folks say, I've got X number of vulnerabilities, X number of quantitative risk. I want to cut it in half or reduce it by this percentage, and I want to consider that a victory. Where there's so much context that gets lost in there that one is adding the business context. What is this device? How important is it to you? But also the low-hanging fruit is very different for the attacker. The low-hanging fruit internally is for me to go out and patch 1,000 Adobe vulns and to see my risk score dramatically drop. Now you should still do that. I'm not saying don't. But using that web server example, I don't want to patch that thing. That opens up additional risk. It opens up additional work for me. I'm going to shoot for the easy targets. Now, outside looking in, when you're talking about malicious actors, that's their low-hanging fruit. I want the easily exploitable stuff. If I'm finding Bluekeep and Poodle, and if Heartbleed still pops up all the time, the attractive, the vulns that we call them celebrity vulns. They've got T-shirts and logos that rival like most organizations. That's the type of stuff that gets newsworthy and pulls people in. So understanding where we can point remediation teams so that you're not just saying, here's a bunch of data, sift through it and pick what you want to do. Here's an action plan. Here's exactly what I want you to do. On the flip side, from an executive perspective, I think it makes sense to show a couple reports in that vein. One is, and we'll come back to the enhanced version of this in just a moment. When we talk about removing friction, this is our flagship report. It's been for years. Top remediations by risk with details. What are the easy wins based on all that other context I've had? And you can scope this however you want. It can be your whole environment, certain subsets of assets, business units, geolocations. How can I most dramatically reduce risk? 25 by default, adjusted up or down as needed. You get rid of almost half your vulns and risk by going out and running some of these patches. And you see all the usual offenders, right? Update browsers, Flash, your Flash, your Reader, your Java. That's going to be the lion's share of on-paper risk for a lot of organizations. So go out and get rid of those, and that's going to remove risk. This is more of that backlog stuff. From an executive perspective, what we also have is something that we've been auto-generating for folks. And you can see this view is a bunch of folks have been creating dashboards and running their own reports here. Is I can run a true executive summary where folks are able to go in and say, what does my organization look like? And this is a little bit better for the true upstream reporting, the execs, the boards, et cetera. We still have some, you have the tendency to incite some fear if you were to go out and say, hey, 770 million risk, but that's pretty good because it was twice that last month. That's going to be a hard sell for a lot of folks. Where that becomes important is showing the downtrends. The risk itself is arbitrary, and a lot of folks will ask us, how are we doing against other customers, aside from the intricacies of opt-in for benchmarking and all that. Everybody's network and organization is truly unique and special for whatever reason. So rather than focus on how you're doing compared to someone else, focus on how you're doing compared to yourself 30 days ago, 60 days ago, a year, and focus on those downtrends. So something like an executive report that is able to show the high level KPI and those hopefully, knock on wood, positive trends is something that really helps. Keep me very honest, Michael, because I answered in a very long fashion for what I think was a pretty straightforward answer. Did I answer?
No, it was good. I mean, it's about okay. To me, it is for executives to be able to see that, but to be able to give more of a granular visibility into or the ability to be a little more granular on how a risk score versus just the old way of saying your risk is 1 to 10. And that's all you've got. You guys give a lot of ability to focus, which was part of what we discussed on the podcast with Jessica, was
Yep.
how do you focus in on the right stuff versus just going and solving a bunch of little things.
Exactly. And in previous lives, using other solutions, and you can use our solutions in not the most efficient way, not the best way as well. That's something we always want to help folks do, is like understand where you're trying to get and how we can get you there. But we used to look at those spreadsheets and we would say, you know, based on just sheer number of vulnerabilities, that was my riskiest asset. And you get back to that model where, hey, this is not an important asset for my organization. This does not sustain one of those critical business processes. Going back to your comment, right? Patch to zero, it looks like a win when you're focusing that work on the wrong things, or those are scenarios where you can just unplug it. We've had instances where, you know, you've got an EOL system in VMware somewhere, and that's, you know, that's one of my favorite remediation efforts, is a good old-fashioned decommission. Just get rid of it if you can. If it's not doing anything positive for you, get rid of it and you see your risk drop. That's an easy win. It's not always possible, but it's something that we see. But, you know, using Jessica's example too, of that, you know, the backlog versus the emerging threats, the important stuff, you could use something like, hey, a vulnerability published age by severity. I want to click in. Again, these are not great numbers, but a known vulnerable lab. Here's all my stuff that's critical that I found more than 90 days ago. So maybe when I'm looking at a backlog that's overwhelming, that's where I start. I start to work with those things and whittle them down. Or from a, you know, a threat perspective, if I go back to my threat feed dashboard, excuse me, in the interest of time, I won't actually generate this, but what you can do is you can actually select all of these, or you can pick, you know, certain ones. No one's ever going to fight you on a top 10 if you made things that easy for them. You create a static remediation project for them. And remediation projects are a living, breathing version of that top remediations report I showed a moment ago. And I'll cut to the chase and say, this is what it looks like. In this case, I said, give me those most common actively targeted vulnerabilities. So I've got, the first thing you'll notice is it's not a list of vulnerabilities, it's a list of solutions. So in cases where patch supersedence is in play, this gets us right to that point, right? I don't want to see, I hate always picking on the Adobe Flash vulns, but if it's patched to the latest and greatest and it removes 500 CVEs, I just want to see that one line item. Just tell me what to do once here, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. But you can sort by risk reduction. You can sort by the number of vulnerabilities. In this case, let's see who our big winner is in terms of risk. So I didn't know it was going to be that, but I kind of knew it was going to be that. So Adobe Flash, you don't want to see these line items. These are in that CSV, every asset is going to have this X amount of vulnerabilities. Just give me the list of assets and give me the solution. Now, yeah, that's a simplified one. Roll out the latest version of Flash and you're good to go. But you can use these projects to assign out this work, and folks can go in and either manage it from the solution. We can send read-only versions via email, and they go ahead and they remediate. And over time, depending on how long this project's open, you'd see what's remediated, what's unresolved as you continue to assess. What we really like is for folks who are going in, one is, again, the parallels to the spreadsheet, we used to print things out in the spreadsheet and go down the list with your Sharpie and you know, run Windows Update or whatever and cross them off. You can still do that. You can mark this as awaiting verification. The next scan will tell me if I actually remove these. You can actually trigger that scan yourself if you want. So you can run a validation scan from the project and say, hey, I fixed these. Folks want that immediate gratification. They don't want to wait. On the flip side, InfoSec, we cross that weird barrier where we're like, guys, get more interested in vuln management and patch management, get more involved. And all of a sudden they're like, yeah, we're bought in. Can I get a rescan? And you're getting those requests, you know, around the clock. Just let the folks do that. So, you know, control it by our back, let them come in and work directly out of their projects and manage that down. As a companion to this piece, and then I'll pause because we're coming to the top of the hour, is we design projects to assign remediation for people to be able to say, here's what you need to do, here's an easy way to view it, here's your body of work. As an overlay to that, we introduced our goals and SLAs. Goals encompasses all three, but what a lot of folks think of when they when they think SLAs is like pen and paper SLAs. Again, going back to the spreadsheets, I found these vulnerabilities on this day, and then based on the severity, based on the nature of the assets, I want them patched within 7 days. And people are going crazy trying to do this with pen and paper. So we wanted to introduce that to just automatically run for you. So in other words, things like, hey, if I find critical vulns on my billing workstations or SQL servers, whatever it is, those need to be patched in 3 days, 7 days, 14 days. You have a rolling target that you can try to stay in compliance with. We also have time-bound and continuous goals. Hey, get rid of all Win 7 by the end of the year, or continuous. I never want to see SSH or RDP or auth services running on internet-facing devices. And this is where you can start to use those other pieces like, hey, Project Sonar, tell me what's internet-facing. InsightVM, make sure that no auth services are opened up on those. And what those let you do is what's commonly asked by a lot of folks is, look, I'm busy. I got a lot of stuff on my plate. If I were to log in and look at one thing, there's a few things I think you should still look at, but you can assign out SLAs for folks to look at, be it ensuring credential success as part of your scans as a VM admin, or I'm not compliant and I'm probably not ever going to be with my SLAs here. But I could go in and say, look, I got those critical vulns on my billing workstations. What are those? I've got a lot of them past due. I've got some that are in that grace period. In this case, I said I have 14 days upon discovery to go ahead and patch those. And very similar to that other view, you can go ahead and take those, slice them out, and dump them into a remediation project. So going back to what my colleague Jessica talks about, manage that backlog down, but focus on the emerging stuff as well, and then focus on the compliance that you set. So if you set these SLAs to say, look, this is what we do, and a lot of folks will say workstations get a little more leeway, 21 days, servers get, 3 days pretty aggressive, 7 days, whatever. Adhere to that compliance, so then you can always measure against that. And then if you want to stick those onto your dashboards, you want to export them to PDF, you want to share them out in terms of access to the solution. Everybody's working with the same information. There's no secrets. Folks can tend to be more bought in because you're also not just dumping a ton of data on top of them. You're giving them ways to manage it down. I know there's more than I could ever squeeze in an hour, but I hope this was interesting and helpful.
Yeah, no, it really was. I've been amazed to see the difference that you guys have, or the differences or the changes that you've made in the visibility and the how you view things and the flexibility that you've created in your Insight dashboards, and letting people focus on where they should focus. There's, I think you kind of made the point. I mean, from an Excel spreadsheet standpoint, and that kind of thing, there's always been this kind of concreteness and lack of flexibility in solutions, and you guys align a lot with how I looked at vulnerabilities. Not just in machines and pieces and endpoints on your network, but into the app space and now into the cloud space, bringing that all in together and getting a holistic view of risk versus just, I've got to go fix this one little thing and that's the next thing to check off my list. I really like the direction that you guys are taking. So excellent stuff. Excellent
That's
stuff.
good to hear. Yeah. And what we want to do is simplify it in such a way that you're still sharing work. I joke sometimes, right? We're not selling water slides. We're talking vulnerability management. Folks have varying levels of feelings on it. And you're adding additional work for those non-security teams. It's vital work, but you're adding work. So let's make it as easy as possible. And the last thing anybody wants is an investigation. Here's a bunch of stuff, figure out what you need to do, but I'm going to come back in a week and your list better be smaller, which is what we still see to this day in a lot of organizations. And when we get out there in the field, knock on wood, 2021, we can get out to some user groups, et cetera. These are my colleagues. These are my InfoSec people. We have a lot of, burden on our shoulders, and we want to split that. We want to share it amongst ourselves in the industry, but also amongst the actual teams, within the customer org. So there's a lot we can do. I didn't talk about containers. I didn't talk about cloud configuration assessment. Those are things we have as well. But we used to be able to do a vuln management demo in 20 minutes. Those days are gone, but that's part of that modern infrastructure too, is staying on top of it. And as as things evolve, giving you ways to assess.
Yeah, definitely not as simple as it used to be, but
No.
bringing it all together is something we've got to do. We can't just focus on the endpoints anymore. It's you're exactly right. So, well, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you everybody for joining us. Really do appreciate it. Justin, thank you very much. This is extremely informative. Yes, we could absolutely have another hour or 2 or 5
Easily.
cover this stuff, but this was a really good, I don't want to say primer, but definitely a good view into how you guys are approaching this. So thank you very much. To end this out, everybody, again, you should have the lunch gift cards. If you don't, let us know or check your spam. Please fill out the survey so you can be entered into that $100 gift card drawing. And also just want to let you know, we have a series coming out by one of our senior solution architects, Chandresh Patel, that's going to be all around vulnerability management. So please be on the lookout for that coming in the next few weeks. One of them will be a co-written blog with Rapid7. So we're going to have some good stuff on that. So if you've got any questions around that, and as always, you can always reach out to us or Rapid7 and ask us if you've got questions around vulnerability management. We've got a lot of expertise between the two of us. And obviously that's what Rapid7 eats, breathes, and drinks every day. So thank you again, Justin. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us. Thanks everyone for listening and giving me your time.
Thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your day.